The Pokemon that last generation after generation seem to be just about impervious to power creep. Even those that might initially stumble in the chaos of a new generation eventually recover their footing and re-establish themselves once everyone realizes just how valuable their talents are. Pokemon that get power crept are generally thought to be one generation wonders, where they may have been fine by the standards of that time, but they probably weren't as dominant and probably dropped instantly once the next gen came around. Today though, we're looking at not good, but great Pokemon that wound up getting completely outclassed. And not always by Pokemon that came later on either, as evidenced by our first example with Salamence, who got power crept by Dragonite. Most Gen 1 Pokemon are the ones that get outclassed later, but not Dragonite. It did actually have this problem originally though. In Gen 3, Dragonite was outclassed by Salamence. Yes, Dragonite had some unique tools over Mence, quite a few in fact, and hardly minor ones either. Its defenses were higher, and its move pool was rife with impactful tools like Heal Bell, Ice Beam, Thunderbolt, Thunderwave, and Focus Punch, which was a major move in the third generation that Salamence debuted in. It's not like people didn't try to make Dragonite work either. They did, in several guises, the most successful one being a Dragon Dancer who used its high special defense to survive various ice moves in a pinch. But it turned out the best version of this Dragonite was actually using Salamence with a lot of special defense instead. Salamence was just better, through and through. It was stronger physically and especially while also being way faster, which effectively made it deal even more damage because it got more in-game opportunities to fire its attacks off. It also had coverage Dragonite lacked in Rock Slide, which was huge since it meant its Dragon Dance variant wasn't stifled by Zapdos and especially Aerodactyl the way Dragonite's was. And even defensively, Salamence's Intimidate ability had far greater impact than Dragonite's bulk for how it helped its team pivot around nearly every physical attacker. In Diamond and Pearl, Dragonite at least had the newly buffed Outrage over Salamence, but even there, Salamence's better speed meant it was still the far superior Dragon Dancer, while its significantly higher special also meant it was a no-brainer when Draco Meteor was involved. And then Platinum came around. Salamence also got Outrage, and Dragonite was really left in the dust. It got superpower as opposed to Salamence's Brick Break at least, but it wasn't nearly enough. Things started to change in HeartGold and SoulSilver though. Oh, Salamence was still far better overall. It was the #1 Pokemon in the tier in fact, but at least Dragonite now had something it could do that was meaningfully different. It received extreme speed, which made it an excellent attacking lead with priority for the faster focus sashes of Aerodactyl, Azelf, Infernape, and Roserade. Outside the lead slot, Salamence was better, but lead Dragonite was basically a mini Salamence whose role Salamence could not do better. It also helped to have this mini Salamence weaken the opponent's team for the actual Salamence later. Extreme speed would be a major part of what led Dragonite to eclipse the Pokemon that had first eclipsed it, as it did in Gen 5, but what really flipped the dynamic between them was the addition of its new hidden ability, Multiscale. Even if it didn't have extreme speed, useful as it was, and indeed there were several successful Dragonite sets that didn't even use it, this change would have single-handedly overcome Salamence's superior strength and speed. Suddenly, Dragonite became one of the most controversial, powerful Pokemon in the game, and then Salamence was suddenly the mini Dragonite that you had to find some justification for over the established metagame standard. Make no mistake, Salamence was still very good. Its higher speed was still quite relevant, and its own new ability, Moxie, made it uniquely threatening late game. But overall, Dragonite was able to take just about any hit from full, stab super effective hits very much included, and this was absolutely enormous in such a volatile, fast-paced metagame. Extreme speed also went a long way in checking the broken monsters. When choice banded, it was an especially efficient immediate weapon against the scariest weather abusers on Sun and Rain teams, Blaziken, Venusaur, Volcarona, both forms of Thundurus and Tornadus, but it was also very strong without a choice band, which would be the case of its Dragon Dance set, which had the opportunities to boost up and sweep even against monstrously strong attackers thanks to Multiscale. Dragonite outclassing Salamence continued beyond Gen 5. In fact, the gap between them continued to increase thanks to how Multiscale tended to make navigating the difficulties of the new Fairy-type metagames much easier. Turns out, you have a lot more flexibility when you can actually take a Moonblast. Standard Dragon Dance sets were as effective as ever though. It didn't need the standard Lumberry. Dragonite could really push the benefits of Multiscale by incorporating weakness policy to turn those full health super effective hits it ate into a source of more power. Dragonite could also pull off other sets that Salamence couldn't dream of, such as taking Gen 5's dreaded mono-attacking sub-Dragon Dance Roost variant, famous for stalling out Pokemon with ice coverage, and using none other than Fly over its previous Dragon Claw, which actually let it generate more turns for leftovers recovery to get it back to full health and Multiscale more easily. Fly also appeared as fuel for Gen 7's Supersonic Sky Strike, which Dragonite used to strong effect on hyper offense teams, and then Gen 8 came around to provide heavy-duty boots, which meant so long as you were careful to avoid taking knockoff, Dragonite would never take Stealth Rock damage and therefore would always have Multiscale active when switching in. It became an absolutely superb Pokemon both offensively and defensively, then took things to yet another level in Gen 9, becoming the best Dragonite since its previous peak of Gen 5 thanks to the many benefits of terrestrialization, most famously Terra Normal in tandem with that other defining tool, Extreme Speed. Salamence was still good, but it was now so outclassed by Dragonite it wasn't even funny. In Gens 8 and 9, it's been even more outclassed than Dragonite had been by Salamence in Gens 3 and 4. Salamence dropped as low as RU in Gen 9, while not only did Dragonite dominate OE from day one, but at the time of this video, it rules over the metagame as arguably the best Pokemon around. Next up, we have another Gen 1 Pokemon, but this time it's the one that is outclassed, with Gengar, who's outclassed by Blacephalon, Dragapult, and Goldango. Gengar was a top-tier offensive menace in the first 5 to 6 generations. How can it be 5 to 6? Well, while it was used for quite some time to strong effect in both Gens 5 and 6, especially the former, it didn't have the lasting impact or consistency that it had and never lost in Gen 4. While Gengar's attacks were seriously threatening in the 2 gens afterwards, those metagames would later evolve in ways that proved to be too much for it. Gengar's frailty had been acceptable in Gen 4 since its power and speed had sufficiently towered over the rest of the metagame in Gens 5 and 6. It seemed like it was more of the same at first, but as the metagame progressed, Gengar was eventually revealed to not be strong or fast enough to keep up anymore. This seemed ridiculous because it was still quite powerful, but, well, it lived in the shadow of the stronger, much faster Alakazam, which was brandishing its newly gained Magic Guard en route to destroying and defining everything around it. It was very difficult to justify Gengar over or alongside Alakazam, given that Alakazam was even frailer, and to try to negotiate Gengar onto the team as well, even though it technically blocked Rapid Spin, just made team building too difficult without sufficient reward to overcome these two Pokemon incapable of taking a hit. Even Gengar's incredible move pool couldn't find a way around this problem. Gengar still had so much to like though, so it still maintained the niche, however slight, especially as there was no real offensive ghost competition since Aegislash kept getting banned. Until later in Gen 7, there was a non-broken alternative. Yes, Gen 7 took away Gengar's long relied on Levitate, exchanging the invaluable Earthquake immunity in favor of Curse Body, but really, Gengar becoming outclassed would have happened anyway, because it still had the same issue of not being fast or strong enough for how frail it was. This seemed especially strange, since Gengar was actually quite good in Sun and Moon. Being grounded at least let it absorb Toxapex's Toxic Spikes, and it was massively threatening with Z-moves, finally letting it get around Focus Blast's terrible accuracy, while it effortlessly crushed Tapu Fini, Bulu, and non-scarf Tapu Lele. Then Ultra Sun and Moon came around, and boom, Blacephalon. Yes, Blacephalon's a little slower, crucially getting outsped by Kartana that Gengar would outrun, but other than that, it's outrunning everything relevant that Gengar would, and hitting much, much harder with a ludicrous 151 base special attack as opposed to Gengar's 130. Gengar was far from weak, even by this Power Crept generation standards. It's equivalent to Latios and Tapu Lele after all, but not only was Blacephalon that much stronger, it also had a secondary stab with better overall coverage in Fire Blast and Overheat. In terms of automatic one-hit KOs, not much matches Blacephalon, which made navigating the Stealth Rock weakness and the lack of having a move to threaten Pursuit Tyranitar much more worthwhile. Sure, Gengar had Focus Blast, but it was also much less frightening to face for the rest of the meta. Blacephalon was so scary against most non-Tyranitar matchups, it was worth being nearly useless in the event that Tyranitar did show up. It was much easier to get a bang for your buck with Blacephalon than with Gengar. This dynamic would repeat in Gen 8, with the gap between them widening thanks to Blacephalon utterly reveling in the removal of Pursuit. But Gen 8 also provided the true Gengar replacement in the all-around perfect Dragapult. True, it's a good deal weaker than Gengar, but it was also so much faster it's ridiculous. Its speed is so high, it can comfortably run a non-speed boosting nature and still outrun everything with ease. It effectively unlocks higher power with the higher opportunities the speed grants it to actually fire attacks off, both in revenge killing and in limiting the switch-in ability of Tornado Styrian, which can switch in and check Gengar with its speed. Dragapult also had an utterly tremendous move pool, which is funny since Gen 8 is also where Gengar finally gained Nasty Plot, but too little too late. Gengar's extra power couldn't come close to matching the endless offensive-defensive utility of Dragapult's tier best speed. Dragapult continued to outclass Gengar in Gen 9, where Gengar also gained Thunder Wave and Toxic Spikes, which would have been amazing additions in few generations prior, but were insufficient here. Gen 9 also added another outstanding, even more tier-defining offensive ghost in Goldango, whose offensive prowess was matched by tremendous defensive utility as well. It blocked hazard removal more efficiently than Gengar ever had, since its Rapid Spin stifling was matched by the shutting down of the fog as well, and was excellent at taking hits and healing them off with Recover. Now, it of course must be said that none of these Pokemon could hope to match Mega Gengar, one of the most busted Pokemon of all, that utterly dominated even Ubers. But seeing as Gengar itself was such an utter menace, hardly some woebegone Pokemon needing a Mega to save it, it's so sad to see a Pokemon so outclassed when it had for some time had such a stranglehold on Gen 3 that some top players had seen little point in running anything else. And speaking of, it was a similar story for our next Eclipse Titan that has so ruled over its prime generation Gen with Keldeo, whose power crept by Urshifu Rapid Strike. Keldeo had many a top player advocating for its ban in Gens 5 and 6. As much as the metagame would adapt to it, the innate strength of its stab combination alongside such excellent power and speed, as well as the ability to take a hit quite nicely, meant that it was pretty much always threatening, always useful, always capable of rewarding the player who could use it well, and so on. Gen 7 seems to go out of its way to load up on amazing answers, seemingly engineered specifically to take on Keldeo. Toxapex, Tapu Fini, Tapu Bulu, even Kartana, which couldn't switch in but was 1 base point faster, and there was serious competition with the newly added Ash Greninja, yet Keldeo still managed the solid niche. It was far stronger than Greninja pre-transformation and couldn't be checked by Ferrothorn, and it had a Stealth Rock resistance and greater bulk to make switching in against things like Heatran easier. And funnily enough, Keldeo's solid bulk, alongside the fact that it resisted both Greninja stabs, made it a good check to Greninja. Then Gen 8 came around, and there would be no more Ash Greninja to contend with. Yet this is where Keldeo really couldn't keep up anymore, because now it was well and truly outclassed. There was now another Pokemon brandishing its same type combination to far more threatening ends, Urshifu Rapid Strike or Urshifu R. This was basically a physical Keldeo right down to the power. It was a little stronger, with base 130 attack as opposed to Keldeo's base 129 special attack, but that wasn't the difference breaker. In fact, it would seem that Keldeo's far greater speed would be a much more significant deal breaker. There were plenty of significant targets between its base 108 and Urshifu R's base 97, such as Garchomp and Zapdos, so what gives? Well, it certainly was nice that Urshifu R's physical bulk was quite the boost over Keldeo's, which was already solid, but what really made the difference were the stab moves. Urshifu R was dealing out much higher, more consistent damage with its fighting stab, close combat. Keldeo had either Secret Sword, which was excellent but not nearly as powerful, or the equally powerful but notoriously inaccurate and unreliable Focus Blast. Urshifu R had both the strength and the reliability. It was the same story on the water side. Urshifu R's signature Surging Strikes hit 3 times at 25 base power a hit, with each hit critting, which put it slightly above Keldeo's Hydro Pump, but with 100% accuracy as opposed to Hydro Pump's 80. Hydro Pump was so unreliable, Keldeo would generally go with the burn happy but much weaker Scald. Urshifu R's effortless higher power and consistency was huge, but also just the start. It also packed a powerful U-turn to majorly threaten the Water Psychic Slow Twin duo that would otherwise safely resist its stabs, and it made up for its lower speed with excellent priority in its powerful stab Aqua Jet, letting it pick off faster, frailer opponents without having to resort to Choice Scarf the way Keldeo could. Being able to revenge kill like this while still offering the wall-breaking power of Choice Band was superb. And speaking of Choice Band, Urshifu R also had another major benefit in its Unseen Fist ability, meaning it broke through Protect, which was a common tactic for bulky teams against powerful choiced wall breakers such as Keldeo itself. Specs had been its go-to set for its immediacy, but it did have the flaw of getting scouted by Pokemon like Heatran and Ferrothorn, which you could not attempt at all against Urshifu R, making it a great deal more terrifying. Funnily enough, the next Pokemon also got equipped by an extremely similar follow-up whose added priority was a major advantage, with Tapu Bulu being power crept by Rillaboom. After Tapu Bulu's massive success with Grassy Surge in its debut Gen 7, Gen 8's new grassy terrain setter Rillaboom seemed like a cheap knockoff, the one you'd have to rely on until Tapu Bulu was added to the game again, which wouldn't be until the Crown Tundra DLC. However, as it turned out, Rillaboom was the upgrade. It seemed strange. After all, its base 125 attack was slightly weaker than Tapu Bulu's base 130, and its mono grass typing seemed far less useful than the grass fairy that had made Tapu Bulu so excellent at switching in against a myriad of popular offensive moves. The fact that grassy terrain now only boosted grass moves power by 20% as opposed to Gen 7's massive 30% sure didn't seem to help the weaker of the two. It felt like you'd really want the higher attack stat to compensate for this drop. However, even after Tapu Bulu returned, Rillaboom was so much better that Tapu Bulu found itself dropping to UU. It went beyond immediate strength, of course. Rillaboom was still incredibly strong with 125 base attack wood hammers, getting a 20% boost under grassy terrain even before potentially being augmented by Choice Band or Stance and even Life Orb, especially since the move's drawback, its recoil, was partially offset by the terrain's recovery. However, it was the moves it was wielding with this attack stat that made it so excellent both as an attacker and as support. Tapu Bulu's move pool was quite good, especially upon gaining close combat in Gen 8, which Rillaboom would have loved over the attack dropping superpower that it had to rely on for powerful fighting coverage, but Rillaboom had 3 incredible key advantages over it. First, Knockoff, with its typing, excellent anti-ghost coverage, and generally helpful item removal, ensuring that even if Rillaboom faced a difficult wall, it wouldn't hold on to its item, leaving the lack of Rocky Helmet or Heavy Duty Boots to be exploited later. Second, this was very good, but wouldn't have had near the impact it did had it not been paired with the other moves, the next of which was U-Turn. This was not just great for the usual purposes of switch scouting, as that was always valuable in letting Rillaboom generate momentum off of its switch-ins, even when it was walled, but also because it allowed Rillaboom to more directly, precisely, and safely enable its teammates to abuse the grassy terrain it set. It could be something as regular as getting a Pokemon in for some extra recovery, or it could be something as game-breaking as an unburdened sweeper like Hawlucha activating its ability by eating its defense-boosting Grassy Seed. The third and most essential move by far, though, was Grassy Glide, which was 70 base power but gained priority under grassy terrain. 70 base power priority was already incredibly strong. That's the same as Sucker Punch in Gen 7 and on, or Gen 9's Thunderclap. But this went even further, since in order to exist in the first place, it needed the terrain that would give it the additional 20% boost. Rillaboom was thus able to put up incredible numbers for a priority move. It was excellent no matter what, but with the Choice Band attached, its Grassy Glide averaged around 50% to Dragapult, which resisted the move, while against the excellent natural physical bulk of Garchomp, it mostly dealt out damage in the 70s from a neutral priority move. You'd think this was Ice Shard or something. Grassy Glide continued to be massively useful even when Gen 9 nerfed its base power down to 55. It still hit much harder than your average priority move, outdoing even Sizzler's Technician Bullet Punch. It was a major part of Rillaboom being so good as a whole that it defied even Gen 9's insane power creep and was OU once again. It's strange seeing as Tapu Bulu was synonymous with sending grassy terrain on switch-in, but Rillaboom really perfected the art. Now, before we go on to the Uber tier finale, we've got a quick honorary mention in how Infernape became outclassed by Blaziken. It was basically the same trajectory as Salamence and Dragonite. First, Infernape burst onto the scene in Gen 4 to completely and utterly outclass Blaziken with an absurd speed difference alongside a far better move pool, most notably including close combat as fighting stab. However, then Blaziken got speed boost in Gen 5 and single-handedly ensured Infernape would forever live in its shadow, wielding its far greater power alongside speed that, after a turn or two, even Infernape couldn't match. To really hammer the power difference home, though, it received the buff High Jump Kick as stab. Now we'll finish things off with the Tale of Time, with Dialga being power crept by Necrozma Duskmane. Fitting for a box art legend, Dialga was one of the most defining Pokemon in its debut generation of Ubers. It was a nearly perfect all-around Pokemon, so good that it could be slotted on just about every team, and often was, as it tended to hover at the very top of the usage stats. The most defining trait of its signature Dragon Steel typing was that it was the one dragon in the game not weak to Dragon, which was major, especially in Gen 4 Ubers, where much of the metagame is Dragon types, that were Draco Meteoring and outraging each other, or Spatial Rending in the case of Dialga's counterpart Palkia. To not be so automatically deleted by arguably the most defining aspect of the tier, while still being able to dish out that defining aspect itself, was incredible, especially since Dialga was able to dish the Dragon Stab out with the best of them, and its typing in bulk also lent itself checking none other than the biggest non-dragon threat, Kyogre. It could do just about anything with its high, well-rounded stats and cavernously deep move pool. It was an excellent hit taker, most commonly running a Stealth Rock support set, occasionally turning its hit-taking capability into a sweep opportunity with the brutally indestructible Special Defense Bulk Up set, but it could also dish out a variety of offensive sets as well. Scarf, Specs, Nyx, sometimes while also providing Stealth Rock support. It didn't just have several variants, its variants had variants, extending into all manner of terror like the Substitute Protect sets that took advantage of pressure, making it incredibly easy to stall out opposing Draco Meteor PP. Dialga may not have been as overwhelmingly dominant in the Power Crept Gen 5, but that didn't mean it wasn't still excellent. It still occupied a thoroughly unique place in the tier. It wasn't until Gen 6 that it experienced a notable decline, but even there, Dialga on the decline was still a seriously effective Pokemon. Now it was a Dragon type that wasn't completely dominated by Fairy types, being neutral to their hits and having Stab Flash Cannon to hit them super effectively. Free Xerneas bait it certainly was, while it also wielded its newly useful Flying Resist alongside Shuka Berry to act as one of the more reliable checks to the massively dangerous Mega Salamence. However, even the seemingly eternal Dialga met its end upon its replacement in Ultra Sun and Moon's Necrozma Duskmane. No, Duskmane wasn't Dragon, but that was no longer a defining offensive aspect of the game in the world where Fairy types were everywhere. More importantly was the Resisting Fairy, and Duskmane's Steel type was uncovered by a secondary typing canceling its Resist out. In Gen 7, Duskmane could become Dragon by transforming into Ultra Necrozma, but it was one of the most essential Pokemon in the meta even without doing so, and continued in this vein in Gens 8 and 9, where Ultra Necrozma wasn't available. Duskmane was also more able to better defensively utilize its Steel typing over Dialga with a number of major advantages. First, Morning Sun's instant 50% recovery, making shrugging hits off throughout the game a breeze. Second, even if you did strike Duskmane super effectively, the damage was reduced to 75% of its would-be effectiveness thanks to its Prism Armor ability. Third, Duskmane was even bulkier than Dialga, with slightly lower HP, more than compensated for with its higher defenses. Sure, it lacked Dialga's Water Resist, but having to use something else to take on Kyogre was worth its many other benefits. While it was an excellent defensive Pokemon, it uses prodigious hit-taking ability just as effectively in support of its impressive offensive onslaught, with a base attack stat even higher than Dialga's special attack and more impressive boosting to boot. With Swords Dance in Gen 7, while also weaponizing its lower speed with the same Trick Room that Dialga would occasionally use back in Gen 4. Then in Gen 8, it could also boost with Dragon Dance. Prism Armor's weakening of super effective hits alongside its tremendous bulk let it really push its power to immense heights by making it the ideal candidate for weakness policy. Dialga was once the power creep itself, pushing Ubers into the age of Draco Meteor, but then it was itself power crept, and now is completely unviable in Ubers. Though in its defense, Game Freak also completely dropped the ball in its even more useless origin form. Dusk main it ain't. And thank you so much to our Platinum patrons. Thank you to Amphozenus, Alex Sable, Anthony Belval Renault, Daniel Isbeast, Corman, Don Creek, Eric Dissing, Funky, Glitcherton, Howl, Jack G, King Yabber, Nightfall, Megamon VGC, Mojo Game Slayer, Nurse Jake, One Penguin to Rule, Pretzel SP, Seagulls Incorporated, Sojiro Sakura, Spavoon, Skylaria, Soras and Croxon, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, Tyler, Kiboflu, Wardine, Zathor for their major support of our videos.